Hello. We have just entered the month of June, and as luck would have it, my ancient air conditioning system just gave out. So before I boil alive within the confines of my own home, let me tell you about some of the books that I have thrifted recently. Many of these I found on my recent hiking trip to Las Vegas in southern Utah, but many of these are from bookstores that are more local to me, as well as the internet. I have 50 books to share with you, many of which are rare fantasy novels, as you can expect, but we also have some sci-fi and literary fiction in the mix as well. Before I share my haul with you, let me tell you about some of the books I've been reading recently. As you may or may not know, The Guardian recently surveyed a bunch of authors and literary critics and at least one supervillain to ask them what their top 10 novels of all time are. They tabulated up the results and then they produced a list, the top 100 novels of all time. This list and the way it was formulated has received some criticism, but all in all, it was actually a much better and more interesting list than I could have initially anticipated. It certainly inspired me to check out some of the books that I hadn't previously read. So this last week, I read my 32nd book from that list, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. This was a very fascinating read and a brisk one too. You can easily read it in an afternoon. Even though this is a book from the early 60s, this reads like a dark inversion of the Dead Poets Society, following a clique of schoolgirls at a posh academy in Scotland in the 1930s. These girls were each handpicked by their eccentric teacher, Miss Jean Brodie, who was famously played by Maggie Smith in the film adaptation decades before she played Professor McGonagall in Harry Potter, to be the brightest and most culturally literate girls at the entire school. The creme de la creme, as Miss Jean Brodie keeps saying. Early on, you are charmed by Miss Jean Brodie, who is kind of a Ms. Frizzle for art and literature. As the story goes on and you're jumping around in the timeline, she becomes an increasingly suspect person. She's like, you should seduce married men so that I can live vicariously through you. And I think Mussolini has a lot of great ideas. Part of the coming of age for these girls is realizing that not only is our beloved teacher a real hot mess in her personal life, she is also a literal fascist. And what do you do with that? Excellent read, highly recommend. Even though I hate what Disney has done with the franchise, I have been getting back into Star Wars for the first time in many years. I am reading a lot of the excellent expanded universe novels, starting off with Shatterpoint by Matthew Stover. I read Matthew Stover's Acts of Cain quartet last year, and it's easily the single best grimdark fantasy novel I ever read. It's also the best cyberpunk novel I've ever read. It's both of them at the same time. What's so fascinating about Matthew Stover's career is that he is one of the few people who is equally esteemed for his original work as well as his franchise work. He wrote some Star Wars novels in the 2000s, such as this, as well as the novelization of Revenge of the Sith, which Star Wars fans absolutely adore because Matthew Stover has incredible prose and complex themes. Stover doesn't treat these Star Wars books as a paycheck. He puts so much effort into them and they are much appreciated. Shatterpoint is from Mace Windu's POV early on in the Clone Wars. He has discovered that a Jedi that he himself trained may or may not be responsible for committing war atrocities on the planet that he comes from. So he has to go by himself deep into the jungle to try to figure out what's up. This book is just Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but starring Mace Windu, and it is so awesome. How much physical, spiritual, and psychological torment can one Jedi take? Even a Jedi as cool as Mace Windu. This book is non-stop suffering, and I say that with the greatest relish. It actually challenges what it means to be a Jedi, and it asks some deeply pertinent questions about the inefficiencies of the Jedi Order vis-a-vis colonialism. Jedi always be like, oh, you can't kill people, that's not very nice. Well, what if settler colonialists are committing genocide, huh? What do you do then? The Jedi Order is fundamentally a reactionary organization. They are always trying to maintain the status quo. But what if the status quo includes hundreds of years of murder and racial injustice? If you like what Andor does in deconstructing the political suppositions of the original Star Wars trilogy, then I recommend reading Shatterpoint because it does the exact same thing, but for the prequel era. Finally, I read Sorcerer's Legacy by Janny Wurts. I love Janny Wurts so much. I think she is a genius. I love the Wars of Light and Shadow, which I have been steadily making my way through for the past couple of years. This is her very first novel. It's a standalone from 1982. And if I remember correctly, Raymond Feist ended up reading this and thought it was so good that he ended up hiring her to help him co-write the Daughter of the Empire trilogy, getting her enough clout that she could spend the next couple of decades writing Wars of Light and Shadow. This is easily Janny Wurts' shortest novel. The premise is pretty convoluted. A pregnant noblewoman whose husband has just been murdered has been plucked from the timeline by a wizard so that she can go to another time and place to romance a prince. Due to magical political reasons, he has been rendered sterile, and if the court at large catches on to that, they will execute him. All of that to say, the real premise, this woman is freshly pregnant. She has 7 days to romance and hook up with this prince so that she can pass off her baby as his. Eliane, the heroine of this book, is one of my favorite protagonists I've read all year. She is put into a situation where she quite literally has no allies, no magical or political power whatsoever. She is entirely vulnerable. Most authors would render her as basically a damsel in distress. But Janny Wurts is able to make her so clever and so daring that she is able to hold her own against evil wizards and these people who are scheming against her and her would-be husband. You just can't help but admire her. I thought this was an excellent political fantasy novel with interesting kind of pseudo-romantasy elements until the very end. One of the only missteps I have ever read from Janny Wurts. I wish there was more of a denouement, more emotional decompression towards the end after the climax. I'll just say in abstract, this book has a happy ending, but Eliane goes through so much trauma in this book, especially in the last 30 pages. Absolute disaster after disaster after disaster. All I wanted was for anyone to come up to her and say, like, are you okay? Do you need to talk? This book goes to such ludicrously dark places that I just wanted extra reassurance as a reader that she ended up okay emotionally and psychologically. Now that I have finished Sorcerer's Legacy, I am going to use that as a springboard for my big summer reading project, Initiate's Trial, the 9th book of the 11-book Wars of Light and Shadow meta-series. So this is the first in a duology, the second being Destiny's Conflict. I read The Alliance of Light, the previous arc in Wars of Light and Shadow last year. I thought that it was a good stopping point to kind of recharge, catch my breath, because I love these books, but they're very dense. I probably won't really be talking about these books on the channel as I read them because I am already so far through the series that there is no way that I could catch you, the viewer, up to them without spoiling most everything that makes these books so good. So what I am going to do instead, I am going to recommend you some other booktubers who have been doing some really excellent coverage of the Wars of Light and Shadow. If you are interested in the series, if you end up reading the series, basically go to those channels because they're doing excellent work. I have to start off with the people I consider the OGs of modern Wars of Light and Shadow discussion, the book club chats that are held by Joanna Reeds, Philip Chase, and AP from A Critical Dragon. When I first started reading this series 2 years ago, they were some of the only people who were reading through and reviewing these books. And since I didn't have anywhere else online to talk about Wars of Light and Shadow, I would look forward to their book club vlog every single time I finished Ships of Merior or War Host of Vastmark or what have you, to immerse myself in their thought-provoking discussion. I also really like the ongoing coverage of the story by John and Jacob from Talking Story, as well as Jake from Nerd Level Rising. These are two of the chillest, coziest booktube channels. Jacob is still working his way through Ships of Merior, I believe, but John and Jake just finished Storm Fortress, so they are exactly as far through the series as I am. I want to be reading Initiate's Trial and then seeing what other people are thinking about Initiate's Trial as well, right? Finally, I also have to shout out Shay, who is another excellent booktuber who ended up doing the official audiobook for The Gallant, and that's just really sick. So go watch those channels. Anyway, I'm gonna talk about some books. I'm gonna do a couple of author spotlights. First up, we have Elizabeth Lynn, who within a 4-year span between 1978 and 1981 ended up publishing 6 books. We have the 3 novels in the Chronicles of Tornor trilogy, Watchtower, The Dancers of Arun, The Northern Girl, 2 sci-fi novels, A Different Light, as well as The Sardonyx Net, and then finally we have her short story collection, The Woman Who Loved the Moon. So Elizabeth Lynn has been on my radar for a long time. Watchtower and Dancers of Arun both came out in 1979. I'm pretty sure they are the first epic fantasy novels that just have open gay and lesbian relationships, and having that sort of normalization of queer relationships in 70s fantasy media is a super rare thing. Because these 2 books came out the same year, they both got nominated for Best Novel at the World Fantasy Award. Elizabeth Lynn competed against herself because these books are just so good. Watchtower ended up winning. That very same year, The Woman Who Loved the Moon ended up winning Best Short Story at the World Fantasy Award. I had loose plans to talk about her for Pride Month now that, again, we're in June. I'm not sure if I have the time to digest all 6 of these books and give her due respect within the next 3 weeks, right? Maybe that'll be the big project for next year. Next up, we have my girl, Evangeline Walton. When I see Mabinogion editions out in the wild, I tend to leave them be because I want other people to be able to find them and purchase them, especially because so many people DM me and say like, your coverage of Evangeline Walton has made the price of her books double, triple, etc. on eBay, for which I am very sorry. But a reminder, we are getting a new Mabinogion omnibus this fall with a new intro written by Christopher Paolini, so go and pre-order that. I found an entire set of the Del Rey edition of the Mabinogion, and since all 4 books were there, I went ahead and purchased them. The Prince of Anun, The Children of Lear, The Song of Rhiannon, and The Island of the Mighty. While the early 70s Ballantine editions are maybe some of the most gorgeous covers in all of fantasy, these late 70s, early 80s Del Rey editions are infamous for being some of the ugliest covers, especially this Song of Rhiannon, which has Ron Jeremy at Stonehenge for some reason. Let me tell you, the book doesn't have this vibe with the eagle and the lightning clouds. Even though these covers are kind of weird and gauche, I still think they're gorgeous. I also ended up ordering 2 of Evangeline Walton's posthumous books. She Walks in Darkness, which is a gothic novel set in the Italian countryside, as well as Above Cariz and Other Stories, which collects much of her short fiction. Author number 3 is Stephen Donaldson. I got the Mordant's Need duology, The Mirror of Her Dreams, A Man Rides Through, as well as his 2 short story collections. Daughter of Regals and Other Tales, this is from the late 80s. Reeve the Just and Other Tales, this is from the late 90s. I've been getting more into Stephen Donaldson this year. I've been collecting his books for a long time because I recognize that he is so influential in the 1970s fantasy scene that I adulate so much. I am working through the Gap Cycle as well as the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, or as I like to call them, the Bionicles of Bomis Bovenant. Stephen Donaldson has a lot of themes that he likes to explore, especially about the interplay between fantasy and reality. But another thing he brings into Thomas Covenant, he infamously examines how a single act of sexual violence can completely destabilize the very format of epic fantasy. Mordant's Need is a re-exploration of many of the themes that Stephen Donaldson previously covered in Thomas Covenant, but from a gentler, feminine perspective. It's about a girl who goes to an alternate world where magic and mirrors intertwine. This is supposedly the hidden masterpiece of his bibliography. So what I'm saying is, if you want to give Stephen Donaldson's intricate prose and immaculate character work a try, but you are not interested in the violence that defines his other big series, then Mordant's Need is the series for you. Next is a literary fiction author, Gustave Flaubert. Flaubert is most famous for writing Madame Bovary, the controversial realist novel asking the evergreen question, what if you blew up your life because you read way too many romance novels? Even though Flaubert is most famous for his realist prose that he demonstrates in Madame Bovary and what's the other one called? A Sentimental Education, he actually wrote in 3 radically different styles. The second of which is demonstrated in The Temptation of Saint Anthony, which is this insane psychodrama about the famous 3rd century saint, Saint Anthony, would you believe it, going out into the desert and just having all of these psychedelic hallucinations, written kind of as a play and kind of as a poem. This was Flaubert's self-professed masterwork. He spent 20 years working on this, and all of his friends would read it and they're like, dude, what are you doing? No one is gonna like this. This is gonna make you 0 monies. He released it and I'm pretty sure it made 0 monies. But then his 3rd style, immaculately researched historical fiction, the main example of which being Salammbô, the classic novel of ancient Carthage by the author of Madame Bovary, or alternatively, Salammbô, the bloodlust and passion of ancient Africa. Salammbô is one of my favorite novels, the only novel for most of human history set in ancient Carthage, and as such, it is the main inspiration for my own novel, What If Salammbô Had Giant Robots in It? Kind of not good, but it's very well written. For years, I've been reading the Penguin Classics edition, and so I was glad to find not 1 but 2 different pulp paperbacks, and you can tell this is the 1950s edition and this is the 1970s edition because this is so 50s and this is so 70s. I have yet another Salammbô for you. Lone Sloan, Salammbô by Philippe Drouillet. Drouillet, one of the great French sci-fi artists, and Lone Sloan is his space opera sword and planet protagonist. This is a huge graphic novel retelling the entirety of Salammbô. It's using Gustave Flaubert's original text, but with this hyper psychedelic sci-fi art. So I'm glad to own this because this is cool and insane. Not only was this a graphic novel, but this graphic novel ended up being adapted into the 1998 Eurojank adventure game Salammbô: Battle for Carthage, of which I am the only human being alive who has actually played it. You're just going through the plot of Salammbô, but everyone is a weird sci-fi demon, and you're like, why do these people look like this? With those 4 authors out of the way, I am done with my author spotlight section. Or am I? I'm sorry, I lied to you about covering 50 books in this video. It's actually a lot more than that. Wait a second, I think I hear something in the background. By God, that's John Cena's music. Brabadee. Imagine that loop is playing. The year is 1805. Napoleon is master of Europe. Only the British fleet stands in his way. Oceans are now battlefields. Master and commander. Post captain. HMS Surprise. The Mauritius Command. Desolation Island. The Fortune of War. The Surgeon's Mate. The Ionian Mission. Treason's Harbor. The Far Side of the World. Major motion picture starring Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany. The Reverse of the Medal. The Letter of Marque. The 13-Gun Salute. This is book 13. Do you get it? The Nutmeg of Consolation. What the hell does that mean? The Nutmeg of Consolation? Are you kidding me? The True Love. One word. The Wine-Dark Sea. The Commodore. The Yellow Admiral. The 100 Days. And finally, Blue at the Mizzen. All 20 of these books by Patrick O'Brien. What more can I say? It's boat fiction. It's boat fiction for dads. Often held as some of the best historical fiction of the late 20th century. I've been planning on reading these books for years, and I was planning on just getting all of them from my local lending library, but a local store was having a book sale and I picked up a bunch of these for $1 a piece. And so I thought, dang it, I just have to do it. I have to collect every single one of these. These Norton trade paperbacks are super easy to find. Just about any used bookstore is gonna have them. This is a series that dads and grandpas collect. There is a 21st book which was unfinished but got published posthumously. I don't know if they ever released that final book in the same trade paperback edition as these other 20 novels, but if anybody knows, I would love to hear about it. Okay, this is the minor author spotlight section where I talk about authors who I only bought 2 or 3 books from. First up is Rosemary Kirsten, who wrote The Steerswoman, as well as its sequel, The Outskirter's Secret. Rosemary Kirsten has only written 4 books, which are the 4 books in this series. She has had plans to write 5, 6, and 7. The Steerswoman is this interesting science fantasy novel. They kind of give it away on this cover. It's in a tavern, but you can see someone is playing Kerbal Space Program. In terms of like aesthetics and genre, it's very fantasy. It's very sword and sorcery. Jo Walton is a massive fan of this series. She said once that not only is The Steerswoman science fiction, it is the most science fictional book ever written. That is such an interesting claim. So excited to read this. I got 2 books by Mary Gentle. I love her Ash, A Secret History. I was able to find some of her other famous books. Golden Witchbreed, Star Trek-y classic sci-fi series about a woman who goes to a planet as an ambassador and she has to like learn to interface with the aliens there. And then the other one, Grunts, which is this parody novel from 1992 following a bunch of orcs who just work for their Dark Lord and they're sent on all of these dumb suicide missions. What if there was a Vietnam War novel, but it's all starring orcs who are like, we gotta take this position or we'll die trying. Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys! Next up is the Barbara Hambly Darwath trilogy. The Time of the Dark, The Armies of Daylight, The Walls of Air. You have all these young people from our Earth who are summoned by a wizard who I guess is drinking a brewski? Is that a literal Budweiser he's chugging? You must come with me, only you can save our world. They go to the other world and then it becomes a horror novel. All these Cthulhu demons and whatnot. Next up we have 2 Ellen Kushner books, both set in her Riverside continuity. One of the most famous LGBT fantasy novels of all time. This is the sequel, The Fall of the Kings, written by Ellen Kushner with her wife, Delia Sherman, who is an accomplished fantasy author all on her own, as well as, this is really interesting, Tremontaine, this multimedia project that Ellen Kushner has been working on for the last 15 years, which isn't a conventional fantasy novel, 13 different short stories or episodes, and then when you read them all together, it's like reading a television season. Next up, we have the Hawk of May trilogy by Gillian Bradshaw. Some absolutely lovely hardcovers here, so I just had to buy the entire set. Hawk of May, Kingdom of Summer, Winter's Shadow, early 80s, kind of YA, historically grounded examination of the Arthur mythos, but I think from the point of view of Gawain. Damn, these books look so good. Books should look like this. Every book should look like this. Hello, I'm back, and in a stunning new gown. This next section will be about literary fantasy, both fiction and non-fiction. The Sword at Sunset by Rosemary Sutcliffe. I think she is a pretty big name in the UK. She specialized in writing young adult novels about different historical periods of early British history. She is most famous for writing Eagle the Ninth, which follows Roman centurions in ancient Britain. This is her most famous novel for adults. This book asks the pertinent question, what if the 2004 King Arthur movie was good? Next up is a different Rosemary, Rosemary Jackson, Fantasy, the Literature of Subversion. So this is a non-fiction book of psychoanalysis about the history of fantasy. What's most interesting to me is that even though this is about the history of fantasy, she is not just citing Tolkien. She has more of a Borgesian idea of what fantasy entails. Per the back, Gothic fiction, classic Victorian fantasies, the fantastic realism of Dickens and Dostoevsky, tales by Mary Shelley, James Hogg, E.T.A. Hoffman, George Eliot, Henry James, Joseph Conrad, R.L. Stevenson, Franz Kafka, Mervyn Peake, and Thomas Pynchon are among the texts covered. So it's talking less about fantasy as a genre and more like fantasy as it appears in all literature, including literary fiction. Astra and Flandrix by Seamus Cullen. Okay, let me just read you the back. Astra and Flandrix represents a departure in the field of fantasy fiction, In erotic Tolkien, Seamus Cullen uses a humor ranging from the gentle to the ribald, has joined past mythology to a post-atomic age. This is technically a dying Earth story. It's a humorous fantasy epic set in the post-apocalypse of Earth. You have two elves who are going around and boning all of the different fantasy races they come across. Tetrarch by Alex Comfort. Deeply weird book. It's inspired by the works of William Blake. So that's already weird and interesting, right? But what makes this book especially weird is the author. Alex Comfort is the man who wrote the runaway bestseller, The Joy of Sex. British people literally did not know how to fuck until 1972. There's actually a movie about it, London by Jason Statham, where he's just in a bathroom talking to Chris Evans. I didn't know what to do with my prick until I read The Joy of Sex by Alex Comfort. Now I know that I need to wave my pecker in the general direction of my wife. I think that's what that movie's about. I haven't seen it. After writing like dozens of these basically non-fiction sex manuals, this was him trying to branch out and be taken seriously as not just a fiction author, but a literary fantasy author. The Twilight of the Gods and Other Tales by Richard Garnett. Introduction by T.E. Lawrence. That's right, Lawrence of Arabia read this and he was like, this is the best fantasy book I've ever read. The Twilight of the Gods is a set of mythology-inspired fantasy short stories, originally written in the 1880s or 90s, I think, but Richard Garnett republished it a couple of times with more and more short stories. This is a new Warbler Classics edition that I bought from the internet. I think they do somewhat bare bones releases of public domain books, but I am really glad that they released this. A lot of the time, if you go onto the dreaded website, Amazon.com, Amazon.com and you try to buy a pre-modern fantasy book, let's say Blood in the Mist or something, you are very likely to get an absolutely dog shit print on demand release with AI cover art. Anyone who makes shitty AI editions of classic literature should be fed into a wood chipper. You can quote me on that. Cloud and Ashes, Three Winter's Tales by Greer Gilman. So Greer Gilman is most famous for Moonwise, renowned as one of the most difficult but rewarding works of literary fantasy ever published. This novel consists of 2 short stories, as well as the novel Unleaving, which is the sequel to Moonwise. Supposedly, she is just about done with the 3rd and final book in the Moonwise trilogy. It's hopefully coming out within the next year or 2. The Dalemark Quartet by Diana Wynne Jones. Diana Wynne Jones, as you might know, is one of the greatest late 20th century YA fantasy authors. She is most known for her fairy tale inspired Howl's Moving Castle trilogy, her satiric Dark Lord of Darkholme meta series, Crestomancy, which I believe is sort of posh urban fantasy. The Dalemark Quartet is the closest thing she ever wrote to straight up high fantasy. I think each of the books in this series are only loosely related. They take place generations or even hundreds of years apart. I love this cover by Yvonne Gilbert. Bring back colored pencils on fantasy covers, you absolute cowards. I purchased not 1, but 2 incredibly rare books by Elsbreg de Camp. Literary Swordsmen and Sorcerers, the makers of heroic fantasy. This is an Arkham Press book. Arkham Press was most famous for doing these like incredibly deluxe, high quality hardcovers for the works of H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and these other weird fiction guys. A lot of those books can be hundreds or even thousands of dollars today because they were printed in limited runs and they're super high quality, excellent collector's items. But they also printed some other interesting fantasy authors, like Witch House by Evangeline Walton was originally in Arkham, as is The Zanzibar Cat by Joanna Russ. Elsbreg de Camp, probably one of the most influential authors of mid-20th century fantasy fiction, co-wrote the Harold Shea series, the Novarian cycle. He helped launch the Conan the Barbarian revival in the 1950s and 60s by writing a lot of new Conan the Barbarian stories. So this is his non-fiction overview of the history of heroic fantasy, which is generally what we would call sword and sorcery today. So he starts with William Morris, he goes through Lord Dunsany, H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, concluding with Lord of the Rings and T.H. White. It's really interesting to see how at this time Tolkien is sort of viewed as a weird spin-off of sword and sorcery rather than the other way around. I also purchased his autobiography, Time and Chance, Joker Man Ass 2003 Microsoft clip art font. The reason why I picked up this biography, it's signed by Elsbreg de Camp and his wife. Isn't that very darling? This is also non-fiction of a sort. An Atlas of Fantasy by J.B. Post. This is the 2nd edition, published by Del Rey in the late 70s. The 1st edition is from the early 70s and is even harder to find. This is just a collection of every single fantasy map to ever exist as of that publication date, including tons and tons and tons of obscure fantasy works that just simply don't get discussed anymore. I have been wanting to make a video about fantasy maps for a long time. I just need to figure out the best way to approach it. Let's talk about some literature. We have 2 Years Before the Mast by Richard Henry Dana. Classic book about men on ships. I'm pretty sure this is just a guy's narrative biography about his time sailing out from Boston, going around the tip of South America, and then parking in California, I guess. It took months or even years years to go from one side of the United States to the other because the Panama Canal didn't exist yet. 2 straight years of adventure of being on a boat. Very fun. Evangeline by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Probably one of the greatest 19th century American poets. You might know him for doing The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Evangeline and the Song of Hiawatha are super notable because I believe they're among the first epic poetry to have North American themes. Just think about how democratizing that is. A lot of people are saying like, oh yes, epic poetry, but it has to have quote unquote epic themings. It has to be about Greek mythology or the Bible or whatnot. No, modern stories about Americans can have the same level of import and pathos as these ancient tales. What's so interesting about Evangeline on a poetic level, which is one of the reasons why this is often taught in schools and textbooks and whatnot, Longfellow is going out of his way to write this entire poem in dactylic hexameter, the same meter that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homeric meter is a mix of dactyls, which is a long beat and 2 short beats, da 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 da, and then you occasionally use a spondy for emphasis. The super famous first line of Evangeline is, "This is the forest primeval, the murmuring glades and the hemlocks." Da 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 da. And having that pattern of meter allows you to remember how the poem goes, right? It helps with memorization. Meter is important, folks. Next up is Lord of the Two Lands. This is historical fiction by Judith Tarr. Judith Tarr is such an interesting author. I want to read more of her. She does a lot of historically inspired fantasy, but this is just a straight up historical fiction novel, Lord of the Two Lands, about the invasion of Egypt by Alexander the Great. Pilgrimin by Russell Hoban. Russell Hoban is a guy with a super weird career. He is most famous for the Francis the Badger books, most of which were illustrated by his wife Lillian. The pair of them also made The Mouse and His Child, which got adapted into a, I don't know, 1978 animated feature. Let me tell you, The Mouse and His Child is maybe the most disturbing children's movie I have ever seen. Boy, howdy, have I seen a lot of those. On the adult half, Russell Hoban is known for writing Ridley Walker, this weird post-apocalyptic novel set in, I think, future England. Culture and language has degraded so far. The entirety of Ridley Walker is written in this bizarre de-evolution of the English language. I think Pilgrimin is his follow-up. Pilgrimin follows a Jewish man in medieval Europe. One day, Jesus Christ appears to him. Hey, Pilgriman, I want you to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Pilgriman's like, why are you appearing to me? I don't even believe in you. And Jesus is probably like, yeah, but you seem a lot chiller than all these Christians, so can you do me a solid with this one? And Pilgriman's like, yeah, okay. Pilgriman is going on these surreal, dark fantasy adventures throughout Europe, and it's bringing in lots of like philosophy and theology and whatnot. Finally, we have the Notebook trilogy by Agatha Christoph. These 3 books follow a set of brothers in World War II, one of whom is named Klaus and the other one is named Lucas. That's right, Mother 3 is a giant tribute to this postmodern Hungarian novel. Can you believe it? They play around with narratorial unreliability. Your understanding of these characters and who they are and how everything went down changes radically from book to book. And I just love when literature does that, so I'm very excited to read this. Hello. Yet another day with no AC, so let's get started. I am wearing a Brandy Sandy shirt for reasons that will soon be obvious. We only have 2 sections left. The first of which is what I will call Mormon, Ephemera. I do not consider myself part of the religion, and in fact I have many problems with it, but for better or for worse, my ties run deep. For example, I am related to Joseph Smith by blood. Sometimes you walk into a Utah thrift store and you find a book called okay, I need to say this straight. You find a book called www.urimandthummim.god. This is gonna require some context. Joseph Smith allegedly translated the Book of Mormon in the 1820s, right? The scholarly consensus is that he had a seer stone, or a magic rock if you want to be reductive about it. He put the seer stone in his hat and he just held it up to his face. I hope you can hear me. And he dictated the Book of Mormon to one of his friends, like Oliver Cowdery or whoever. Belief in seer stones and divining rods and other folk magic practices was very common in early 19th century America. As the project of Mormonism grew and expanded, it's claiming direct continuity with the proto-Christianity practiced by Christ and the apostles. And if you're including all of these early 19th century superstitious beliefs in your religion, that might be seen as invalidating it, which is a real shame because I actually think that they should own the folk magic. I think that's genuinely a really cool thing. So what the story develops into, Joseph Smith found a pair of spectacles, these two giant crystals that were set in a silver bow, and he would hold it up to his face. That auto-translated the text of the golden plates into English so that he could dictate the Book of Mormon. These two giant translator crystals are called by modern Mormons the Urim and Thummim. And like many aspects of Mormonism, that's appropriated from ancient Hebrew religious practice. The Urim and Tumim were two stones that Moses' brother Aaron could use to determine yes or no questions. So it was basically a magic 8-ball. They'd ask, like, should we go in this direction? And they'd scatter the stones and you'd get a yes or a no. All of that to say, www.urimandthummim.god by David H. Swingler, Mormon sci-fi thriller novel. An adventure archaeologist who is clearly a stand-in for the author himself discovers, would you guess it, magic crystals in Jerusalem, and he has the brilliant idea to plug those crystals into the motherboard of his laptop that allows him to chat with God on AIM. It's the premise of the hit NBC sitcom God Friended Me. This man and God have all of these philosophical conversations about science and nature and the universe, all of which conveniently confirm modern LDS orthodoxy. William T. Belcher unironically says, as praise, like, oh, this book's as good as Dan Brown's writing. The other book I got is not nearly as fun. I purchased this at the gift shop for Zion National Park. The Mountain Meadows Massacre by Juanita Brooks. Because Mountain Meadows is like a 75-minute drive away from Zion. If you aren't familiar, the Mountain Meadows Massacre is one of the big atrocities committed by early Mormon pioneers. In 1857, so 166 years ago, there was a wagon train from Arkansas that was passing through southern Utah on the way to California, as many people were doing at the time. It's the California Trail, right? This was a time of extreme tension between Mormon settlements in Deseret, as Utah was called at the time, and the rest of the United States. There's lots of paranoia amongst Mormons at the time that the feds are going to come come in and shut down their whole operation. There is this innocent wagon train that is cutting through South Utah. A bunch of local Mormons somehow get the impression that this is a big psyop by the federal government to spy on them. So they disguise themselves as Native Americans, maybe or maybe not on the orders of Brigham Young. It's kind of a scholarly controversy to this very day. They attack the wagon train and they murder everyone. Well over 150 people. Men, women, and children. Point blank executing them one after another in cold blood. They only spare children who are, I believe, age 5 or below. The kids end up being taken in by local Mormon families where they are then neglected and abused until they are rescued by the US Army a couple years later. It takes 20 years for there to be any legal action for this vile act of mass murder. Of that huge posse of men, only 4 are indicted, and then only the ringleader, Brigham Young's adopted son, Alan D. Lee, ended up getting hanged for the death of all of these people. This was the first ever history book written about the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1950 by Juanita Brooks. Anyway, sorry for the really dark history lesson, but knowledge of Mountain Meadows has been covered up and suppressed, especially by the Mormon hierarchy, for well over a century. For a national tragedy of that scale, I think it is really useful for people to just know about it, right? Final section. We're looking at pulpier genre fiction, a mix of fantasy and sci-fi novels. The first one, Fritz Leiber's The Knight and the Knave of Swords. This is the final book in the Lankhmar series, which I am currently reading through right now. Most of the Lankhmar books were published in the early 70s. 6 books released in the span of a couple of years. And then this final capstone volume isn't released for another 20 years after that. Lankhmar is Fritz Leiber's life work and an absolute classic of sword and sorcery. He spent over 50 years writing all of these short stories, which are set in the titular city, and they follow 2 adventurer bros. The tall barbarian, Fafod, and then you have the tiny little rogue, the Grey Mouser. Every story is just these 2 dudes going on different sword and sorcery adventures. They are trying to steal rare jewels or find Atlantis or whatever. The stories are a real delight to read, especially because Fafod and the Grey Mouser are so devoted to each other. They're the biggest of bros. I would argue that 90% of D&D's DNA comes directly from this series. And then this book, written much later at the very end of Fritz Leiber's career, is his epilogue for the characters. What if Fafod and the Grey Mouser grow old and they get married and they retire and they just have a happily ever ending? I love this so much. Mention My Name in Atlantis by John Jakes. I gotta read you the full title. Mention My Name in Atlantis, being at last the true account of the calamitous destruction of the great island kingdom, together with a narrative of its wondrous intercourses with a superior race of other worldlings, as transcribed from the manuscript of a survivor, Hopter the Vintner, for the enlightenment of a dubious posterity. John Jakes has a really interesting career, kinda known for sword and sorcery, the Barbarian books. He also wrote the sci-fi novel On Wheels, which has one of the most infamously weird covers of all time. But what he is most known for is writing a bunch of dad-core historical fiction novels, such as his revolutionary epic The Rebels or his Civil War epic North and South. He also wrote this very bizarre sword and sorcery parody. Do you know how I know it's good? Cigarette ads in the middle of the book. Following up with 2 more pulp science fantasy novels. Both of these come from the recommendation of Matt from Bookpilled. Matt mostly reads sci-fi and he tends to be kinda skeptical of fantasy, but because he is so discerning about fantasy, whenever he highly recommends something, I always make sure to check it out. I trust his opinions way more than most. The first of these books is The Dark World by Henry Kuttner. Henry Kuttner is an early 20th century pulp author writing in the 1930s and 40s. He was married to C.L. Moore, who is famous for the G.R.L. of Joyery stories. I have G.R.L. of Joyery over there. What's really cute about their relationship, he secretly co-wrote all of her books and she secretly co-wrote all of his books. So The Dark World probably has a lot of passages that were written or edited by C.L. Moore. Matt really loved this book and I have already given it a read, and I am glad that I did so because it is just so interesting and weird. It's a portal fantasy from the 1940s about this veteran who ends up teleported to this alternate dark fantasy world, you know, the Dark World, so to speak. All human beings have a copy in this other dimension. His copy is the Dark Lord of the land, the evil overlord. Keep in mind that this was published a decade before Lord of the Rings, so Sauron did not exist yet in the public consciousness. So what do you think the name of this Dark Lord is? Who is the biggest villain in all of fantasy who can be name-checked? That's right, Ganelon from the Song of Roland. Learning that fact really makes me feel justified in my general project of going back and reading all of these old works and these old authors, you know, reading the Song of Roland and E.T.A. Hoffmann and Marie de France and whatnot, because the more of these old proto-fantasy works I read, the more I see their DNA in these more modern works. This is another book that Matt loved that I haven't gotten around to reading yet. The Sword of Rhiannon by Lee Brackett. Science fantasy, planetary romance. Lee Brackett was one of the only women who was writing John Carter style stories in the early 20th century. She also wrote the original draft for Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. We're gonna transition from planetary romance to space opera. I have Coriolanus the Chariot by Alan Yates. This novel is apparently pretty bad. I guess I got it for the title. This is set on a planet where the laws are dictated by the plays of William Shakespeare. I don't know, it seems really dumb. You should watch the modernized film adaptation of Coriolanus, starring and directed by Ralph Fiennes. The villain is played by Gerard Butler, and for like half the movie, you're thinking, why did he cast Gerard Butler? He cannot perform this Shakespearean dialogue for shit. He's trying to choke it out in his thick Scottish accent. He and Ralph Fiennes finally confront each other halfway through the movie, and then they have an 11-minute knife fight. And then you're like, oh, this is why they cast Gerard Butler. He's just like doing CQC. Next up is Golem 100 by Alfred Bester. Alfred Bester is famous for writing two of the most beloved and influential 1950s sci-fi books of all time. The Demolished Man, which I haven't read, and The Star's My Destination, which I have read. After doing this 1-2 punch, he kind of slows down. I think he's probably just writing short stories mostly. In the 80s, towards the end of his career, he wrote this, Golem 100. When writing this novel, Alfred Bester set out to make the most shocking and daring and offensive novel he possibly could, just to push the boundaries of what science fiction could be, right? And by all accounts, he succeeded at that. In the future, bored housewives summon a demon. The demon is Golem 100. Except the thing I want to point out is that it's not actually Golem 100. That is a superscript. So it's Golem to the 100th power. Golem times Golem times Golem times Golem, murdering trillions of people throughout the universe. This could be the next Cthon. Next up is a space opera that people like way better. The Dragon Never Sleeps by Glenn Cook. Glenn Cook is most famous for his Black Company proto-grimdark fantasy novels, following a group of mercenaries who will do horrible things for the right price, but ultimately have a heart of gold. He also did the Garrett P.I. fantasy noir series, which I talked about in my previous video about the series namesake, Randall Garrett. This is often held to be his best and most underrated book. Glenn Cook went to his publisher and he said, hey, I have an idea for this cool epic space opera, right? Has hundreds of characters, dozens of factions, versions, yada, yada, yada. And his publisher said like, oh, that's cool. We want you to be sticking to the dark fantasy and the mystery. You know, space opera is too out of your wheelhouse. So we will allow you to write one book. He took every single idea he had and he crams all of it into a single 400-page volume. This is one of the most dense and rewarding space opera novels. Imagine that you can just read the entirety of Dune in just one book. I read a couple chapters of this and it was awesome. He had introduced like 7 POV characters by page 20. Star Wars, Heir to the Empire, book 1 of what is known as the Thrawn trilogy. Heir to the Empire famously invented the Star Wars expanded universe. Return of the Jedi comes out in 1983. This is kind of inconceivable to the modern mind, but there is just absolutely no Star Wars media coming out. George Lucas was working on other projects, but then in the early 90s, Timothy Zahn writes Heir to the Empire, which is a direct sequel to Return of the Jedi. We got Han, Luke, and Leia fighting against the remnants of the Empire, who are now led by a blue-eyed chiss named Mithrondo, who is this cold and hyper-tactical leader. This book was literally so good that it renewed the entire Star Wars franchise into the media juggernaut that it is today. Next up is one of the weirdest novels in the Star Wars expanded universe, Splinter in the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster. Alan Dean Foster is maybe one of the most prolific writers of franchise tie-in and novelization work of all time. I mean, after all, he wrote the novelization of the single best movie ever made, and that movie is Krull! This movie's so good. Krull is awesome. Alan Dean Foster ghost wrote the original novelization for Star Wars in 1977. That novel is credited to George Lucas, and it is still credited to George Lucas to this very day, but Alan Dean Foster wrote the whole thing. Impressed by his work, George Lucas contracted Alan Dean Foster to write Splinter of the Mind's Eye, a direct novel sequel to the original movie Star Wars, only published a year later in 1978. So to put that into context, for 15 straight years, if you wanted to read an adventure of Luke Skywalker that wasn't in the movies, this was the only option. The fact that it was written so early in the Star Wars project makes it very weird for a multitude of reasons. If Star Wars ended up being a flop and didn't make enough money to warrant a full sequel like The Empire Strikes Back, they could at least use this book to make a budget B movie sequel instead. Han and Chewbacca are written out. We don't want to include aliens like Chewbacca. Harrison Ford would be too expensive by this point. Just Luke, Leia, and Darth Vader palling around on a mist planet where you can't really see anything. So the sets would be really cheap too, right? Other thing that this book does, which is super infamous, it ships Luke and Leia. Luke and Leia are super horny for each other in this book because it was written before George Lucas had conceptualized them as siblings. I recently went to a local Renaissance fair with a couple of friends. I had a pretty solid time. I went to the little alcohol pavilion, got a beer and some mead, and I was chatting with my party about how even though Dave Filoni has many faults as a writer, the one thing I did appreciate is that early in season 2 of the Clone Wars, he brings back Cy Snoodles so that she can have weird sex with Zero the Hutt, and I absolutely loved how upsetting and disgusting that was. And then the dude at the next table overheard me and went, "Oh, looks like that guy had too many beers." I just played it off. I nodded and gave a little calm bodhisattva smile and then continued with my conversation. But at the same time, fuck off, bro. If the 21 plus beer tent at a Renaissance festival can't be a safe space to talk about weird Star Wars alien sex, then where can I go? Huh? Asshole? But fortunately, Ellen Datlow, one of the most prolific editors of 90s and 2000s fantasy and sci-fi, has an answer for us. And that answer is Off Limits, Tales of Alien Sex, featuring lots of interesting authors. Joyce Carol Oates, Samuel R. Delany, Robert Silverberg, The Bastard of Albion. I don't really like to invoke the name of the man that I call the Bastard of Albion. I believe it's an algorithmic curse. It's like citing the name of Beetlejuice. But this quote from the back cover is too good not to read aloud. From Neil Gaiman's examination of predator-prey relationships to Samuel R. Delany's classic depiction of how the altered fit among us. Predator-prey relationships, huh? Do you remember that really bad verse Kanye had on Katy Perry's Extraterrestrial? Pockets on Shrek, rockets on deck. Tell me what's next, alien sex? Well, the answer is yes. One more example of space eroticism to see us out. The Dragon's Claw by Roberta de Bono, a novel of romance and adventure, fully illustrated. You will not find this book on Goodreads. This is semi-illegally published Star Trek erotica. This is literally fan fiction. This is an unauthorized book about the next generation of the Enterprise's crew. And I don't mean Star Trek The Next Generation, but what I mean is that this follows Kirk's grandson and Sulu's kid and all of the different kids as they go through the Star Trek Academy and end up having different interplanetary adventures. It has the spice of an average romance novel. For whatever reason, Captain Kirk's grandson ends up on some like desert planet and he meets a princess, and I think towards the end of the book they end up hooking up. She actually says to him like, hey, Captain Strange, won't you be my lover? You're the best thing that I've ever discovered. Flash Gordon's left me. He's gone to the stars. And evil Darth Vader, he's been banished to Mars. Tell me, Captain Strange, do you feel my devotion? Or are you like a droid, devoid of emotion? Encounters 1 and 2 are not enough for me. What my body needs is Close Encounter 3. I lost my heart to a starship trooper, crashing light in hyperspace, fighting for the Federation. Hand in hand we'll conquer space. I lost my heart to a starship trooper. That song got her cast in Phantom of the Opera. What can we say? All applause to Sarah Brightman. Hey! I didn't mean to end yet another video with a musical interlude, but how many chances do you have to play erotic space disco? I'm gonna go lie down and cool off. Have a good day! Bonk!